Hello. Thanks for joining, everybody. We're going to wait a couple of minutes because I am expecting a bunch more people to join us. Monica, I was so pleased to see your name in the waiting room. How are you? Oh, I hope you can hear me. Oh, maybe she can't hear me. Oh, okay. That's fine. It's just nice to see familiar names. Baha is you as well. I can see that you're driving, so please do pay attention to the road. There's a recording that I will definitely send you, so don't worry about missing anything. Oh, well, I do have a lot to get through today, so I may just start. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I promise we'll come back around to them. I'm going to share my screen. And I want to move pretty quickly through the material so that I have time for your questions, because I know that this can be a really sort of confusing, sometimes overwhelming, hi Heather, topic, and it's connected to a lot of other things. There are a lot of moving parts here. So I definitely want to leave time for your questions. So here I go. I'm going to try to share my screen, and then we'll go from there. Let's see, sharing. All right, can I get a thumbs up from somebody, maybe Heather, because I can see you. Okay, great, thank you. Wonderful. All right, so we're here to talk about the digital SAT. And I threw in this subtopic of other related topics because there's a lot here. As I said, these things are all kind of connected, and I want to make sure you get the forest and the trees, because I think that'll be really helpful for you in making decisions for your child, your family, and what do you do around this question of testing. All right. So those of you who don't know me, sorry, I just jump in like everybody knows who I am. I'm Sheila, Signet's president and COO. I've been in this field for, oh my goodness, almost 20 years. And I started as an SAT tutor. I'm one of those people that I'm very blessed that testing has always come easily to me, but I'm also one of these people who likes to kind of pick things apart and really understand the mechanisms by which they work. And that has really helped me become a very good test prep tutor. And now I run the business. I still tutor some students, but mostly I'm running the business and developing curriculum and coaching my own team of tutors. Today I just want to share some information with you about the digital SAT, what you need to know about the testing landscape. How do you decide whether to take either the SAT or the ACT, or go test optional, which is also one of your options. So like I said, it can be very confusing and overwhelming. So even though I'm going to speed through all of this, I hope that you'll find some clear frameworks to help you make the decisions that are right for your family. Like, I can't tell you what to do. I don't know enough about any one of you or your kids, but I will give you enough information and the tools and the data to be able to make the right decisions for yourself. So let's get into this. First, I want to start by painting a picture of how colleges actually look at college applications, so you know what role the SAT or the ACT might play in your student's ability to get into a college or not. The majority of colleges in the United States use something called holistic admissions, which means there's not like a strict formula of, the GPA counts for 20% of my decision, and the extracurricular activities counts for another 15%, and everybody uses that rubric. That's just not the way it works. And what they're trying to do is allow every student's unique strengths to be the thing that leads their application. Now, there are certain kind of buckets that are going to be more important than others, but it's not a strict formula, and it's not applied the same way to every single student, even within a single college. So the National Association of College Admissions Counselors, or NACAC, which is an industry group that we're a part of, does a survey every year of all of its member colleges to see what is the most important thing for them, what gets the most importance in their process of evaluating students. And this list has not changed a lot in the last 15 or so years, but there is one change that I want to highlight for you. We can see just off the bat that SAT, ACT scores are somewhere around fourth. It really depends on if they're required or optional at a school. There are some colleges that we call test blind, that even if you have a perfect score, they're not going to be looking at it. You have no way to submit it to them. So that one kind of gets an asterisk because it's going to be different at every school depending on their policy. But grades and rigor of the curriculum, how hard the classes your student took, are the two most important things just across the board. That has not changed in a very long time. And even when tests were required at the majority of colleges, they were still third or fourth on the list. They were not at the top ever. So testing is not the end all be all. It can be important. It can be helpful to your student, but it's not like it's the only thing that matters. And the change that I was talking about that showed up last year was this character one. They now pretty much all agree that positive character attributes are a major factor in evaluating a student's application. And you can't tell a student's character from their SAT scores or even from their grades. That all comes from their essays, their extracurriculars, the teacher recommendations, their community engagement, how they spend their summers, all of this other stuff that we may think about as like softer in a way. How they show up in the world is actually really important to the college application. So when you are thinking about embarking on testing, I want you to think about it in the right level of priority. If your students' grades are shaky or they need to really bring up their GPA, I wouldn't, embark on the process of doing testing at the expense of their ability to bring their grades up, right? Or to develop extracurricular community engagement, build relationships with teachers, because character is so important, more important than testing in a lot of places. So that is just a little bit of an overview here. If you want to see the full list and the exact percentages that colleges responded at, you could just Google state of college admission, factors in admissions, and then the acronym NACAC, NACAC. And that's a very interesting report to look at every year. But okay, let's focus in on testing. Before we get into our deep dive about the digital SAT, I want to make sure you know there are two options for students who are considering submitting a standardized test score with their college applications. There's the SAT, which is going digital starting next month. And then there's the ACT, which is launching a digital version as well. It's not as different as the digital SAT is from the paper SAT, but they do have an option to take it on a computer now. The digital SAT is scored out of 1600, so this might be familiar to you from when maybe you took the SAT. There was a short stint in there where the SAT was out of 2400, but they've gone back to the 1600 scale. You can get up to 800 on the verbal section, which consists of reading, writing, and language, and then up to 800 on the math section. And this new digital SAT is much shorter than the paper SAT was by a little more than an hour. There are still 4 sections, but it is what we call adaptive. So adaptive means however the student does on this first module is going to affect how hard the second module is. And same with the first module of math is going to affect how hard or easy the second module of math is. And that is a big change here. And we'll talk about some of the other changes in the formatting of this test as well. The ACT also has 4 sections, but they're each discrete topics. We have English, math, reading, and science. And the content is still very similar to what's on the SAT. It's just arranged a little bit differently. So reading and English are part of the reading and writing language section of the SAT. The science section on the ACT is really like a technical reading section where you're reading about maybe a scientific experiment, and you also have to read charts and graphs. Those kinds of questions are interspersed throughout all sections of the digital SAT. You're going to have a passage or a section on the reading on the SAT that has some charts and graphs and is full of scientific jargon, right? So really the content is very similar. It's the way the questions are asked. The SAT kind of has that brain teasery feel. You do get more time per question, and students are going to need it. And then there's the ACT, which you get less time per question, but the questions are far more straightforward, and they look a lot more similar to what a student's going to see on, your typical math test or something like that. So in some ways, it's more accessible, but the speed of it makes it very challenging. All right, we're going to go into more of this. Detail on the digital SAT. So they actually released the digital SAT this time last year internationally. So all over the world, students were taking this test on a computer. It went off mostly without a hitch, certainly without any major scandals or security incidents like we've had before with the SAT, where entire countries have had their test canceled because they find out that the test has been compromised and somehow somebody got a version of it and shared that before the test was actually administered. And that's really one of the major motivators for them switching to this digital format, is to have increased security. And then it starts digital in the US next month. The last time anyone could take a paper SAT was in December of 2023. The PSAT, if your student took it last fall, was also digital in preparation for the launch of this new format. As I mentioned, it is shorter than the old SAT, and you have more time per question. There is a built-in calculator called Desmos that is so valuable to getting through the math section. And you can use it on the entire math section, but it is a tool students will really need to learn how to use to be effective with it. But once they learn how to use it, they can use it to solve like 90% of the math problems without actually knowing any math. And I'll give you an example of that a little bit later on. Desmos is a calculator that exists outside of the SAT as well. And there is a kind of a demo module that students can play with right now. So if you Google Desmos, you'll find that. And I really encourage them to get familiar with it as soon as possible. I mentioned this adaptive testing, that the second and fourth modules depend on how accurate the student was in the first and third models. And getting into that harder module or getting stuck in the lower, easier module do lock students into score bands. So it looks like if you get about 65% of the first module correct, you'll get into the harder module, and then you could get up to an 800 on that section. But if you get less than 65% right on the first module, it's a little different between verbal and math, but 65% is kind of in the middle. If you get less than that right on your first module, you're going to be in the easier second module, which means the maximum score you could achieve is around a 600, even if you get everything in the second module correct. Right? So it's extremely important for students to be super focused and as accurate as they can possibly be in the first module. And of course, we want them to do well in the second module too, but that first module performance really determines what their overall score could be. The verbal sections on the SAT are also very different in structure and content. I'll show you an example of this later. But instead of having a long passage and then having like 10 questions to answer about that single passage, on the new SAT, you get 3 or 4 sentences for each question. And there are 54 questions. So there are 54 of these little texts that students will have to get through and answer either a reading comprehension question about or a grammar question about in order to do well on this section. And so some students really hated the long passage and the 10 questions about the same boring long passage that their eyes glazed over when they were reading. And they may like this, something new every time, and they don't have to hold so much in their mind to answer the questions. But I think a lot of students are also going to be challenged by that, right? This 54 short little passages is a lot to get through, and you have a little more time per question, but some of those passages will stay in their heads. And it might be hard for them to kind of clear it out and stay focused and move on to the next text. It also may feel like because they have less questions about each text, they have less opportunity to get really familiar with what the text is saying or how it works. Whereas when you have a long passage and 10 questions about it, you get to build your understanding and familiarity with the passage as you move through all those questions. And so some students are going to love this new format and some students are really going to hate it. So this is why, as you'll see in a future slide, it's really important to choose which test your student can do best on and focus on that between the SAT and the ACT. The other thing I think that's important to know right off the bat with the digital SAT is we have very limited official practice materials. The College Board has only released 4 practice tests, and that's it. We don't really have other practice questions or practice tests to work through. And we know the thing that actually moves a student score the most is doing full practice tests in realistic conditions. So there are third-party people that have made their own tests, like the Princeton Review and Kaplan and countless other test prep agencies. My philosophy is students should be practicing on official materials because that's the best approximation of the testing experience. But while we have these limited materials, you will have to look elsewhere for practice materials, and they just may not be as good. So keep that in mind. So let's look at the power of Desmos here. Here's a question from one of those SAT practice tests. I don't know how many of you are doing algebra on a daily basis. This is, par for the course for me, but any of you may be looking at this and saying, well, I don't even know where to begin. And I would venture that many high school students, even if they've just taken algebra, are going to notice that this is a little different from many of the system of equation type problems they've seen before, because we have 3 variables and only 2 equations. There is a mathematical way to solve this. It involves, shuffling these equations around, manipulating them, plugging one into the other, all of these things. But if you know how to use Desmos, it becomes very easy. So we have some screenshots of the Desmos calculator. I popped these in so we could see how this works. But you can type in the 2 equations, and you will have to learn how to type in the math into Desmos. And then you set up what's called a slider for that t value. And the only real piece of math you have to understand is, if we go back to the question, the system has no solution. When a system of equations has no solution, that means we are looking at 2 lines that do not intersect. That's the only piece of math you need to know to solve this. You set up this slider, and then you just slide this little dot around until you get 2 lines that don't intersect. And it tells you, well, t is 5. So the algebra for this would take me, someone who's very familiar with this, at least 30 to 45 seconds. And typing this into Desmos took me about 12. And I didn't have to use much of my math knowledge. And this is a medium level problem. You can imagine how helpful it is on a harder level problem. So I really encourage students to get to know this calculator and all the ways you can use it. And then here's a snapshot of what one of those reading, writing, and language questions looks like. They call this a short text. This is kind of long. It's pretty dense in my mind. It's also from an 1854 novel. So, we're going to have some, archaic language and sentence structures here. And they've, chosen this one on purpose. They want this to be hard, a text that students have to struggle with. I would say this is a harder problem on the reading section. But this is a good kind of question that is pretty exemplary of the kind of thing they're going to see. Which choice best states the function of the underlying sentence in the overall structure of the text? A lot of students are going to want to jump in and read the text in its entirety before looking at the question. But in order to get through all of this and stay really focused on what the question is after, I actually recommend students read the question first and let that dictate what, if any, part of this text they actually read. We're not going to work through this, but I just wanted to show you what this looks like so you can have a sense of, is this something your student's going to like or not? And then beyond those 2 big kind of format things that I just showed you, there are the differences of taking a test on paper versus on a screen. And of course, our teenagers are more used to working off of a screen than I think us old people are. So there is the difference between reading on a screen and reading on a piece of paper. Your eyes just move differently. You might have a different level of tolerance for looking at a screen than looking at a piece of paper. So if eye fatigue is a thing, that's a thing that you want to think about. It can be more difficult to do the scratch work for the math problems. So writing out your calculations, there is space for human error, even in typing it into the calculator. If they type it in wrong, or if they copy the equation down wrong, they could mess up their calculations. Whereas on a paper test, they can do their calculations right on the page. They don't have to recopy any of that original information. And so there's maybe a little less room for that kind of error, though calculation errors, of course, are always possible. Another piece of this is they're not going to be able to mark up a passage, like circle keywords or draw a bracket around, a particular part that they need to pay attention to. There are tools that are built into the SAT testing platform that allow them to do some of that. And same with using the process of elimination. Like there are ways to cross out an answer, but you're going to interact with it a little bit differently on paper versus a screen. So those might be things you also consider could have an impact on how well your student can perform. But overall, this all means that the digital SAT really requires students to learn how to take the digital SAT, much more than just knowing the content or even being familiar with the question types. They're going to need to know how to use the tools in the testing platform. They're really going to need to know how to approach each question. And so I think that is going to be where the challenge is going to lie for a lot of students, is the test taking skills and the familiarity, not so much the content. And to be fair, knowing how to take the test is really like half the battle on the SAT and the ACT in their current forms, but it's more so in the digital SAT. All right, moving on. We've done our deep dive on the SAT. I am going to talk about how to choose between the SAT and the ACT in a minute, but I want to stop here to talk about what test optional actually is. So test optional is an admissions policy that says students do not have to submit ACT, SAT scores in order to be considered at a particular college. And this was something that was in place and gaining momentum before COVID. During COVID, of course, people couldn't gather to take these tests. So virtually every college, except a handful, went test optional. And then as we've come out of the pandemic, many colleges have made their test optional policies permanent, or they've extended them. And there are still the majority of colleges that are test optional as we look ahead to fall 2025 admission. Now, there's been some media frenzy around Dartmouth and Yale reinstating their testing requirements. We do think there will be more colleges releasing their permanent decisions on test optional in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. But this actually should inform how you approach this question, right? You really want to understand, is testing something that's going to help your student, or is it something that's going to be a waste of time or a distraction for them from other things that might be more important to their applications? So just looking at a couple of policies, Harvard is test optional until the 25-26 application cycle. So we got a little more time if you want to be applying to Harvard without tests. And at that point, they're either going to extend that policy to be permanent, or they're going to say, we're going to go back to requiring tests. But basically, they're just gathering data to see how their students who got in without test scores are doing in their classes, and what success rate they graduate with, to see if that is fine for them to not require tests anymore. The University of California system has been test-free for quite a while now, so it's one of these places you can't submit tests to. Columbia announced this year that they would become permanently test optional. And then I just mentioned Dartmouth. I wrote this slide before Yale announced, but Dartmouth, Yale, MIT, Georgetown, and Purdue have brought back the testing requirements. So if that's a school that is on your students' list and it makes sense on their list, because the list is something that you can control, and I do encourage you to think about whether it makes sense for them to apply to a test required school if testing is not going to help them. But if one of these schools is on the list and it belongs on the list, you are going to have to test. But you're still going to have to decide between the ACT and the SAT if you're going to test. So this is what that looks like, right? I'll tell you how to decide, but you're going to have to decide between the ACT and the SAT. And I really encourage you to just choose one of them and go full steam ahead on that one. They are different enough that your student's going to have to learn different strategies, and different kind of muscle memory needs to be built. So it's better for them to just be preparing for one of them instead of both. You're going to have your student prepare for 3 to 4 months. That's the average at Signet with a one-on-one tutor. There are places where you could do a course where maybe you're meeting 4 hours a week and the course is 4 or 6 weeks. And so it can be done in less time. But I like to see a 3 to 4 month runway. You're going to spend that time diagnosing your students' strengths and areas for improvement and making specific plans around practice and building on those areas that need improvement. You're going to have time for study and then practice. As I mentioned, the practice is the thing that actually moves the score, but you want to make sure that they're practicing in the right way. They're practicing good testing habits. So the studying, the diagnosis is actually very important before you go all in on practice. Once you've done the preparation, you're going to take the test. Most students do take it twice or even 3 times. Colleges don't care how many times you take it. Usually once we pass 3, I say, all right, let's stop here. There are probably other things that you should be doing. And it's not worth you testing again, but 2 or 3 is very common. And then you want to make sure that the scores are locked in by the fall of your student's senior year. If they want to apply early somewhere, they're going to need a test score by November 1st. If they're just planning to apply to the regular decision round, they're going to need a score by the end of December. So that's all in the fall of senior year. I personally think it's much better if they can get the testing out of the way in their junior year. Even before the summer after junior year, because you want to save that for writing essays. So I like to start this process the summer after sophomore year, deciding between the ACT and the SAT and setting up a plan for preparation during the course of 11th grade. Now, if you decide to go test optional, and again, I'll tell you how to decide this in a minute, you really need to start by identifying colleges that are the right fit for your student and have a test optional policy. You really want to make sure you commit to that decision. The last thing you want is to have built this college list and written all these essays, and then a month before everything's due say, oh my gosh, should we have taken the SAT, right? We don't want to have regrets on this. So really make sure that you're building a good college list and you're really comfortable with this decision. And you also want to double down on your strengths. That actually goes for whether you're testing or not testing. Figure out your strengths and really lean into them and find ways to demonstrate your academic abilities and the values that you share with the colleges that you're targeting. You're going to renew your focus on grades. You're going to take maybe some academic extracurriculars, not just sports and music and creative endeavors, but maybe something that's more related to an academic field that you're interested in. And you really want to make sure you live your values in your community. And that could be at home, in your town, at your school, in your city, in broader ways. But that's one of those things that colleges are looking to assess those positive character traits and what kind of student your student will be on their campus. And that's a really important piece of all of this. So now I get to how do you decide? And I know I'm just rambling at you. I'm sure you all have so many questions. So we'll pause in a minute here. But to decide, I think every student, whether they think it's likely or not they're going to do well on these tests, I think every student should take some practice tests to get some data. So then you can make an informed decision about testing or not testing and which test and all of this stuff. So you can get free practice tests on the College Board website or on the ACT website. I can point you towards those. If you need them, let me know. We also have a testing platform that we use to do an ACT diagnostic. If you want to do an SAT diagnostic test, I'll send you to the official College Board website, but I'll ask for your scores. And then we put those through an analysis that we have to understand if your student has the right content knowledge, if there are gaps that they need to learn some material. We want to assess their testing skills and whatever those strategic insights instincts they have, especially around timing, if they understand how to take this kind of test just naturally. Some do, some don't. And then we also want to assess their comfort levels and, of course, their scores on the SAT and the ACT they do. And there's an official concordance that translates an ACT score to an SAT score, so we can really see which one they perform better on, and we'll make a clear recommendation of what kind of score they could get to. This is a screenshot of one page of our ACT diagnostic. We'll be able to say, and we've been doing this for so long, we can say pretty accurately with this much prep, they're probably going to get to this score, and that opens the doors to these kinds of colleges, or this would be a helpful score at these kinds of colleges. We can help you understand what they need to study, when they should start studying, and how they should prepare and how they should study these things. Is it practice questions? Is it learning the underlying material? Is it, X, Y, or Z? When they should test, when we think they'll be ready to hit that target score. And then that's always a conversation with a parent around, okay, well, they're in the school musical, or they've got a spring sport, so we can't really find the availability to study then. So we got to move it ahead. So it's a little bit of a puzzle, but we'll figure that out together. And then, as I mentioned, how these scores are going to play a role in your college applications. And I think that piece of it is almost the most important part, because I don't want you spending all this time, energy, and money preparing for a test and then getting a score that is not going to be helpful at the schools that really are a right fit for you. That will be a complete waste of your time and effort. And so really we want to figure out, does this diagnostic indicate that they can get to a score that will be helpful for the kinds of schools you're looking at? Does that mean you should change the schools you're looking at, or does that mean we should change your thoughts about testing? So even after you talk to somebody like me and have done these practice tests, you still need to make the right decision for your student, and you know them best. I think it's really important to think about their stress levels. There's some students that these tests just freak them out. And yes, some students can overcome that test anxiety, and we have really great experts who do well with that kind of student. But there are some students where it's just not even worth it. It's going to blow up their lives if you try to push this on them. And so you really want to gauge that. You also want to gauge their availability. If studying for the SAT is going to take up, let's say, 3 hours a week for them, is that going to put them in danger with another commitment they have, or their grades? Are they going to not be able to study or sleep? Right? Those things are important. And then what's their ability and desire to close that score gap? Right? I'll be very honest with you. If I see a score come in that's like really low, or there's some sort of fundamental problem in the way they approach a certain kind of thing, I do believe every student can learn to do very well on these tests. For some students, it's just going to take longer than others. And I'll tell you very honestly if I think that length of time is worth it or not for your student. But if they have no desire to do this, if they are not bought into this, if they are sure that they want to go to, I don't know, UC Santa Barbara, which doesn't require scores, well, then why do any of this? I think it's fine. You don't have to do it. And a general guide here also is, if they can score at or above a college published average, which you can just Google, they should test and submit their scores. And if that doesn't seem likely that they can score at or above that average, or if preparing for a test is going to derail them or cause too much stress, just don't do it. There are plenty of schools that accept a good amount of students without test scores, and there are some schools that are test free. So you have options there. And this is the first year we've had data from colleges about how many students enrolled that did not have test scores. So you can look that up. If you Google the common data set and the college that you're thinking about, you can look through this report that they put together. It'll tell you the percentage of students that had SATs and the percentage of students that had ACTs, and then therefore the percentage of students that had neither. And you'd be surprised. It's a pretty high percentage at NYU, University of Pennsylvania, Vanderbilt. Some of these very selective colleges admit a lot of students without test scores. So keep in mind, as I mentioned, right after 10th grade is a great time to start this plan, the planning process. You don't necessarily have to prep and test right away, but you need to start early enough to allow for the work you may have to do. right? If your child is a junior and is just starting to think about testing, that's fine. It is not too late. The vast majority of juniors take the test in May or June of junior year. So you got time. I'm glad you're here if that's the case for you. And if your kid's a sophomore, we also have a little time just to know that we're going to start the planning process maybe in June, maybe a week or two after school is out. And if you would like to do that planning process with me, it's totally free, no strings attached. You could just send me an email and I will get you set up. I'll set a reminder. I'll reach out to you at the end of May and we'll do this whole process and you'll come away with a plan and some information that you can use to make your decision. I also want to let you know that you're going to see this out here. Selective colleges with test optional policies have seen their average test scores rise. So the example I like to use is the University of Chicago, which actually went test optional in 2015. And since then, every year, their tests, the average test score has gone up because only students with the strongest test scores are submitting them, right? So when you look at those averages, they are a little bit inflated, right? There may be students who could get in just fine with a slightly lower test score. So most of the time we like to look at the middle 50% of scores, and that's a good gauge. If your student is in that middle 50%, then you can be pretty sure submitting the test score is going to help you. Admission rates are higher for those with test scores than for those without, and that's mostly because the people who are submitting test scores have really strong test scores, and that tends to indicate they're a very strong student and maybe from a wealthy family and come from a culture of, a long line of people who have gone to college. And so they kind of know how to move through this system. So it's not just they had a strong test score and that's why they got in. Right. There are a lot of other things that impact that. And as I mentioned, if you look at the common data set for each college that you're thinking of, you can see the percentage of enrolled students who applied with or without test scores, and then gauge for yourself, like, okay, do we have much of a chance if we apply without test scores? Or actually, oh, this is a pretty good percentage of people who get in without test scores. I feel comfortable not submitting test scores. Okay. Oh, I actually think that's my last slide. So I'm going to stop my share and then just take questions. I do feel like I was talking a mile a minute. So, don't feel shy if you have to ask about something that I already touched on. I'm happy to go back over it. So what are our questions here?
Hi, Sheila.
Hi, Kate.
I have two questions. They're both about the pre-test. So the
Okay.
pre-SAT now you said is a version of the digital. Is that correct?
The PSAT. Yes.
The PSAT, right. Okay. And do the scores that they get on that accurately predict, barring, of course, more studying and whatnot,
Yeah.
how that performance is likely to be?
So the College Board says that they designed the scoring on the PSAT to be exactly in alignment with the scoring on the real SAT. So that the PSAT is a little bit easier than the real SAT. So the maximum score you can get on a PSAT is a 1520, not a 1600. But if you were to get a 1520 on the PSAT, they're saying if you take the SAT the very next day, you should get a 1520. I don't know how accurate that is. I mean, that's all like internal College Board research. And usually what happens is people take the PSAT and they're like, oh crap, I better study. And then they go and take the SAT. So of course it's going to go up from there, or they've had the experience of taking the PSAT. So they're a little bit more familiar. And so the next time they take a test like that, it's going to go up. So that's the way the College Board says it works.
Okay. And then the other question I had is about the pre-ACT.
Yes.
And same question, like, is that predictive?
Define that score to be predictive. The pre-ACT is a lot shorter than the real ACT. There are some schools that give a pre-ACT. Usually it's in the spring of sophomore year, and then the PSAT is given in the fall of junior year. There are some schools that also will give a PSAT 10 in the spring of sophomore year. They've even designed a PSAT 8 and 9. And really, these are all just marketing tools for these two companies to like win test takers. They're always competing for market share. So, colleges don't see any of those pre-tests at all. There is one scholarship connected to the PSAT, but Many people don't know this, that the National Merit Scholarship is about $2,500. It's not that big. For so many people to be worried about getting it, it's not that big of a scholarship. Excuse me. So I say if your school's not giving one of these tests already, you can just take a real practice test, a practice test of the real test, not a P or a pre. Just take the real SAT or the ACT, and there are practice materials available on each of those companies' websites.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What other questions do we have? And maybe by show of hands, how many people, and you can use your little Zoom reactions, how many people feel overwhelmed when thinking about this? Oh, nobody, or maybe nobody knows how to use that reaction. Okay, how do I feel so overwhelmed? Thank you for being honest. Yeah, I think the natural reaction is overwhelm. Just imagine what your kids think and how your kids are going to figure this out. So usually your high school doesn't have a testing expert on staff to walk you through all of this. Many high schools will just say, take an official test of both and then study the one that you think is that is better. But I think that's missing like half the picture here. And some colleges will want to see all of your test scores, not just your highest. So I don't like students taking official tests until they know which one they're going to do and they actually study for it. So that's why we do this service for free, because I just feel like I don't want anybody going blind into this. I got a question in the chat. If I can find my chat, hold on. Here we go. Got a chat from Deb. What are some cost-effective prep materials that are available? Well, Khan Academy is totally free, and they have material from the College Board on their site that you can use. It doesn't really come with here's how you use the material, or this is the order you should go through it, or any of that. And your student needs to be quite disciplined to move through it, methodically and in a consistent way. But that is totally free. The ACT has some free materials on its site, but nothing as robust as Khan Academy. Some kind soul did a whole mapping of what Khan Academy video lessons match up with ACT topics. So you might be able to find that out there and then be able to move through that in a free way. But the Khan Academy doesn't have anything that's tailored to the ACT the way it does for the SAT. But there are a lot of other places out there where you can get good prep at a very low price. So I mentioned Kaplan and Princeton Review. There is a place called Prep Smart that is gaining a lot of traction. The guy was on Shark Tank for his SAT product. And I've had students do that program before and they've come out with good scores. There is also a platform we really love called Test Innovators. And it's a digital testing platform. Again, it doesn't come with a lot of instruction, but it's great for practice. And then, of course, you can always get a book, right? They still print those Princeton Review guides to the SAT and things like that. And the strategies that any testing company is going to tell you, they're basically the same, right? They're branded a little bit differently, but the way you move through the test is pretty much the same. So if your student is a real self-starter and can be very disciplined, I think a book or one of these testing platforms is a great way to go. If your student maybe does better if they know all their friends are also doing a thing, then I would recommend a class. There are very few in-person classes these days, but there are lots of them that are online. And then if your student has test anxiety, a learning challenge, or just does better when they're working one-on-one with somebody, then I would recommend a one-on-one tutor. But after you do those practice tests, I'm happy to tell you what I think would be most effective for your kid. And even though we offer one-on-one tutoring services, I only recommend that when that's something that is clearly needed here over and above, the self-study or the class. So I'm not going to give you the hard sell on that. Good question. Are there any adaptive practice tests available on College Board site or or elsewhere. All 4 of the practice tests that are on the College Board site are adaptive. And then everybody that's making their own material is trying their best to make an adaptive test as well. So everything that you'll see for the digital SAT should be adaptive.
Hi, Sheila, I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Khadijah.
So, the PSAT, is there some program to help prepare the student for that also? The program that you mentioned to Signet Education?
Yeah, it's essentially the same as test prep for the SAT, is test prep for the PSAT. I usually don't recommend students do any prep for the PSAT, unless their official SAT date is around the time of the PSAT, then that prep overlaps. But usually it's not necessary. But some students who may know that they're going to take a longer time to reach their goal score may want to use that as an interim goal, right? I want to get this on my PSAT, and then I'm going to build off of that and go on to my SAT. Does that help?
Thank you. Yes, it does.
Great, great. Well, maybe I answered all of your questions about the SAT or just scared you into silence. But I'm happy because we're here and we've got the time. I'm happy to answer questions you have about other topics like building a college list or maybe planning summer. I know that's a thing that's on a lot of people's mind right now, is what do we do for the summer and how does that relate to college applications?
I have a question that's not related at all
Oh,
to
go ahead.
testing, just because I'm in the midst right now of the course selection
Okay,
with
yeah.
2 of my high schoolers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, the AP versus honors versus GPA,
Yep.
protect the GPA. The conversation is just, it's so contradictory. I would love to get your thoughts. If you,
That's a
especially
great
if you
question.
really want to, like, you don't know what your journey's or what path you're pursuing yet. Like anything within reach, it's a matter of how hard you want to go. But I mean, like I've heard, for instance, with our district and the high school options, there's a ton of AP options. There's a senior graduating with 14 APs.
Okay.
And I'm like, is that the expectation for most graduate? Like if you're going to go the more elite college route, that you're expected to have 10 to 14 APs and have 4 or 5s on every one of them? Or is it no, like you want to take a rigorous schedule, the hardest that you can? And is that based on the student or is it based on what the high school offers?
Great question. It's like all of it. And so I'll do my best not to contradict myself, but that is certainly something a lot of people are facing right now. I know all of my students are like, can we talk about my courses for next year? Because they've got to lock those in pretty soon in the next month or so. So the hype over APs is really intense. And like you mentioned, this one kid graduated with 14 APs. That is certainly more rare than common and is certainly not the expectation of a college. They base their evaluation of a student's curriculum on a couple of things. One, what is actually offered at the school? There are many schools that don't offer any APs. And that is on both ends of the spectrum because they're maybe an under-resourced school and they don't have an AP curriculum. Or some of the most elite prep schools do not use the AP curriculum because their classes, they believe, are actually more rigorous than AP. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I get clients all the time, from both ends that are worried about this. We don't have any APs. Colleges are not counting APs. It's not like an arms race in that sense. But they do want to see students taking the hardest classes that they can do well in. And that balance is going to be different for every student. And it might mean they can handle 1 AP class, but not 2. Or 3, but not 4, or 3 as long as they're in the humanities and they're not in the sciences, right? And every student is going to be different. So the things that I want a student to balance when they're choosing their courses, number one, you got to meet the requirements of your high school, right? If it's the next class that you can take in that sequence of things you have to take, well, then you're going to have to take AP Calc if that's the math class that's, appropriate for you next year. Second is what's their ability to handle that level of coursework? Is it, is it going to be easy for them to go into a class that has a lot of memorization and writing and reading, and jump into 3 of those all at once? Or is there a way that they can, with some prior planning, take one year and maybe 2 or 3 the next year, and then, even more the next year, so that they're gradually building their skills with that kind of learning? And then the third thing would be if there are particular interests, right? And it may not be they know they want to be a chemist, but if they think they're going to go into the sciences and they also think that they're going to be looking at the most selective schools, then yeah, we want to be striving for the hardest classes. And if that happens to be AP at your school, then that's what it's going to be.
Okay.
Right. And in the STEM fields, they are going to look to see that there is an AP Calc, right? If you're applying to a, let's say a college with a less than 20% acceptance rate, maybe that's a thing that they're going to be looking for if the student is going to go into the STEM fields. So this is obviously very nuanced for each student and each school district. So I'm happy to have a deeper conversation with you about this if you want, but it can be tricky. But I don't want people defaulting to just taking as many APs as possible if that's not sustainable for your student and not really aligned with their interests at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it still protect the GPA over taking a lot of APs, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I would say it's, they do look at both things separately, like the rigor of the curriculum. Is it above average or below average for that school? And what are the grades they got? They look at those 2 things separately. Deb has a question. My student has only taken biology extensions. Is it necessary to take physics or chemistry in order to be a strong candidate? She's ambivalent about a career in STEM. Well, I would say, would taking physics or chemistry help her be less ambivalent? It might help her know, like, oh, definitely not for me, or it might help her decide, oh yeah, I really love this. I would say it's not necessary beyond whatever your high school requires. Usually it's 3 or 4 years of a science. And I can't imagine they have 3 or 4 years of biology that she could take. So she might have to, delve into some of these other areas of science. And then deciding between those would be like, well, what does she think is more interesting? What fits in with her schedule? What fits in with the workload that she can handle? And physics often goes along with learning a higher level of math. So if she's ready for that, then physics might be a good choice. But if she's just really interested in chemistry and likes doing that kind of thinking, because often there's a lab there, that might be a better fit. I don't know if that really answers your question. I think it depends a lot on what your high school requires. I tried, yes. I appreciate that. Any other questions? I've learned from my career as a teacher to wait at least 7 seconds every time you ask if there are questions. So I'm just going to be silent. We're going to sit here in silence for a minute. What I'm doing while I'm waiting for other questions. Oh, Monica, I'm so excited to work with you again. That'll be so nice. I am pasting in the chat a course that we just released on summer planning. That's another thing that I'm getting a lot of questions about these days, besides, course selection and SAT college list. What do we do with the summer, and how does summer actually impact college applications? So I put together a little course. It's about 40 minutes long, asynchronous. You can watch it on your own time. There are resources that come along with it. And I wanted to share with you in case that would be useful for you. We talk through, when to start planning them, what kind of activities you might want to be thinking about, and how to decide where to find these activities, whether it matters if it's a selective program or how expensive it is, or it's on a prestigious college campus or not. And how do you create opportunities that might be great for your kid too. So please check that out if that feels like it would be helpful to you. Your student has another question, Deb, go for it.
Yes, my student is watching this with me.
Okay.
I want to say hi. So we were talking about the holistic view on students and how the number one concern is like grades and that they've continuously challenged themselves with this test scoring being around 4th or 5th in their stack range criteria.
Okay.
For grades, how can they tell by looking at a transcript that this student challenged themselves? Is it that they had like regular classes sophomore year and AP classes junior year? How do the, with how many applications they see and how many different schools they are, how do the admissions folks interpret that the students challenge themselves?
Well, it's a great question. And there are actually two ways they do that. So one is something called the school profile or the school report. And that is something you might be able to find it on your school's website. It should be publicly available to you. If you can't find it, ask the counselor, can I see a copy of our school report? And that is something that gets sent along with the student's transcript that describes what the school offers, how many APs, how many students take an honors curriculum versus an AP curriculum, or why we don't have APs if we don't. Here's how we calculate our GPAs. Here's the progression of science classes that we recommend, so that colleges, even if they have no familiarity with the school, have something to reference so that they understand the context that the student is coming from. So the school report is a really important piece of it, and you should be able to see that because schools are supposed to make that public with you. The second thing is most college admissions offices are structured by region. So you'll have a regional admissions officer who is responsible for, let's say, Southern California. Usually it's like 2 or 3 states that are kind of close to each other. So that means not only do they read all the applications that come in from that area of the country, they also have a responsibility to travel to all of those high schools where they usually get students from and do information sessions and participate in college fairs in those areas. So they get to know those schools really well. And it's their job to understand, what does the curriculum look like? What are the students look like from these particular schools? And then this is the thing that with the Supreme Court decision that happened this last summer, the regional admissions officers are one of the levers that colleges can pull to increase diversity, where they're not just going to go to, the high school that's in the affluent suburb in their areas. They're also going to go to different kinds of schools so that they can reach different kinds of students, because the thought is if they widen the pool of applicants, they will get a more diverse pool of applicants, even though the SCOTUS decision may limit the diversity. I just went on a whole tangent in the weeds there. Did that help you, Deb, and your student?
I think so. I think understanding about the school report probably is the biggest piece of it. So yeah, I think so. Did that answer it for you? Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, great. And keep an eye out with your college counseling department. They should tell you when college admissions officers are coming to visit your school, or they'll be, sometimes they like pool together with a couple of other colleges and they do an info session with like 3 colleges together in your local area. So you might want to try to go to some of those, and then you can understand who the person is who's responsible for your region. A lot of admissions offices, if you go to their website, you can see who the regional admissions offices are for, various parts of the country. And then you kind of know who is going to be reading your application, who you should be looking out for when they come to visit, or who you might want to meet at a college fair. That was a good question, though. Great. Well, we are about out of time. I'm going to put my email in the chat here. You should have gotten a couple of emails, reminders and stuff from me today. But if you have specific questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you want to start that diagnostic testing process, or you want me to set a reminder to start that process with you in June, please just send me a note. I'm happy to do that. Like I said, I just enjoy helping people around this because I know it can be so overwhelming. So please don't hesitate to reach out for help. All right. Thank you, everybody. It was nice to see you.
Sheila.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you, Sheila.